Imagine standing in a frozen trench at minus 30 degrees Celsius. The air is so thin and cold, it feels like a physical weight pressing against your chest. Every breath, a crystalline, jagged edge in your throat. You are positioned in the Suwalki Gap, a 60-mile strip of land that the Pentagon calls the most dangerous place on Earth. To your left, the border of Lithuania. To your right, Poland. Somewhere in the pitch-black tree line ahead, the 76th Guards Air Assault Division Russia's elite VDVs moving. You can't see them. You can't hear them. Your high-tech sensors, the billion-dollar eyes of the NATO alliance, have been blinded by a localized electromagnetic pulse. You are a tripwire. If you fire, you trigger a global apocalypse. Suddenly, the sky above you doesn't just brighten, it shatters. A massive, high-altitude magnesium flare ignites, turning the midnight sky into a sickly, artificial noon. We never expected it to be triggered by a lost patrol, a malfunctioning GPS, and a single, desperate flare fired by a terrified 20-year-old sergeant. To understand the midnight flare, we must first strip away the propaganda. For Russia, it was a corridor that separated their heavily militarized exclave of Kaliningrad from their allies in Belarus. It was a 100-kilometer choke point where the geography of the 19th century met the lethality of the 21st. This wasn't a sudden invasion. It was a symphony of chaos conducted in the shadows. The heavy silence of a lost battalion began to haunt the Polish border guards. The gear was no longer just a rifle and a plate carrier. It was a web of network sensors, biomonitors that tracked heart rates in real time, and augmented reality visors that highlighted targets in the dark. But as any soldier will tell you, the more complex the machine, the more spectacular the failure. November 12th, 2 a.m., a reconnaissance platoon from the Russian 104th Air Assault Regiment was patrolling the Belarusian side of the border. They were elite, but they were human. They had been operating in a high-intensity electronic warfare environment for weeks. Their GLONASS navigation was flickering. Their maps were outdated. In a blinding permafrost storm, they drifted. It was a tactical error of less than 400 meters. They crossed into Poland near the village of Szyplishki. They didn't come with a roar. They came like ghosts. But they stumbled directly into the sights of a Polish Grom Special Forces unit that had been lying in wait for 72 hours. At this moment, the human element superseded the strategic element. The Polish commander, Captain Janusz Kowalski, didn't have a direct line to the president. That first shot didn't just kill a Russian lieutenant. It punctured the fragile bubble of the 21st century. Within 90 seconds, the 0 hour had arrived. This wasn't a flanking maneuver. It was a desperate, close-quarters scramble. The Polish unit called for extraction. The Russians, believing their sovereign territory was being raided by NATO commandos, unleashed a localized artillery barrage. The landscape was instantly transformed into a furnace of fire and ice. The Russian battery commander back in Belarus, fearing he was about to be counter-targeted by NATO F-35s, did something that had been forbidden in every war game for 50 years. He fired the Midnight Flare. It was a high-altitude, multispectral illumination round designed to clear the fog of war. Instead, it lit the fuse of a global holocaust. To the thermal sensors of a circling American RC-135 spy plane, the heat signature of that massive flare magnified by a freak atmospheric inversion looked exactly like the thermal bloom of a tactical nuclear weapon. In the bunkers beneath Washington and Moscow, the clocks didn't just start ticking, they started screaming. The RC-135 rivet joint aircraft, flying at 30,000 feet, was the pinnacle of American signals intelligence. Its crew were trained to detect the faintest electronic whisper of a mobile missile launcher or the heat spike of a jet engine. But they were not prepared for a false positive of this magnitude. When the flare ignited, the plane's automated threat detection algorithms bypassed the human operators. Within 4 seconds, an operational flash signal was transmitted to the National Military Command Center in the Pentagon. Sir, seismic sensors are silent, the analyst replied, his voice cracking. Confirm the EMP, Thorne pushed. Ionospheric monitors are stable. No electromagnetic pulse detected. In those seconds, the world hung by a thread. If Thorne had followed the manual, he would have picked up the gold phone. He would have briefed the president that Poland had been nuked. And the president, faced with the total loss of the European theater, would have had no choice but to authorize a proportional response. But while the generals in Washington were debating the physics of the flare, the soldiers in the Suwalki Gap were fighting a war of a different kind. On the ground, the midnight flare had a more immediate and terrifying effect. It didn't just light up the sky, it blinded every night vision device within a 5-mile radius. It was a graveyard of rusted iron in the making. It was a collision of two high-tech giants who had been blinded by their own brilliance. The Russian platoon that had started the skirmish was now entirely gone, vaporized in the first artillery exchange. But their death was no longer the point. The point was the Russian Northern Fleet, which had just received orders to leave port and engage NATO carriers in the Atlantic. The impossible odds had become the reality. We were no longer talking about a border dispute. We were talking about the end of the Holocene. As Segment 1 closes, the flare is beginning to drift toward the Earth, its light guttering. But the fires it started in the command centers of the world are just beginning to roar. The question was no longer, will there be a war, but can we stop it before the first intercontinental missile leaves its silo? The legacy of this moment would be carved into the psyche of every survivor. It was the night the sun rose at 3 a.m., and for 3 minutes everyone on Earth was already a ghost. The midnight flare had landed, but the midnight war was just beginning. While General Marcus Thorne's hesitation in the Pentagon had saved the world from a localized nuclear exchange, it had done nothing to stop the kinetic slaughter unfolding on the ground. In the Suwalki Gap, the fog of war was no longer a metaphor. It was a physical, choking reality. By 4 a.m., the Suwalki Gap had become a killing box. This was a cyber blackout of unprecedented proportions. Soldiers found themselves in a 21st century war fought with 19th century methods. Imagine being a tank commander in the Polish 18th Mechanized Division. Your augmented reality visor, which usually highlights friendly and enemy units in glowing icons, is now a flickering screen of system error messages. Your GPS shows you are in the middle of the Baltic Sea, 300 miles from your actual position. You are blind, deaf, and trapped inside 70 tons of steel, while the forest around you is being systematically leveled by 152 millimeters heavy artillery. The conflict wasn't a clean surgical strike. It was a symphony of chaos. The Russian T-14 Armatas, moving through the thick Polish pines, utilized their unmanned turrets and active protection systems to shrug off the first wave of NLAW anti-tank missiles. The infantry engagement was even more visceral. This was the human element at its most raw, men fighting in the mud and the snow, where the weight of the gear, nearly 80 pounds of ceramic plates, batteries, and ammunition, turned every movement into an agonizing struggle for survival. The graveyard of rusted iron began to grow. By dawn, the road between Shiplishki and Suwalki was lined with the smoldering husks of Leopard 2PLs and Russian BTR-82s. There were no extraction points. The medical evacuation helicopters were being swatted out of the sky by man-portable air defense systems, manpads, from both sides. As the lack of IFF identification friend or foe signals meant that everyone was a target. This wasn't just a ground war. It was the first total domain conflict. While the tanks traded fire in the gap, a silent war was being fought in the fiber optic cables beneath the Atlantic. Russian naval assets, including the specialized Yantur research vessel, had successfully deployed deep-sea submersibles to tap and then sever the primary data cables connecting Europe to North America. In an instant, the global financial markets collapsed. The digital blackout meant that the NATO High Command in Brussels was effectively cut off. From the White House, this was the terrifying turning point. Without a reliable line of communication, the risk of a tactical nuclear launch spiked again. Every commander on the ground, isolated and under fire, now held the power to decide if the situation had escalated to the existential threshold. In the Baltic Sea, the symphony of chaos reached a crescendo. The Russian Baltic Fleet, based in Kaliningrad, had turned the sea into an area denial bubble. NATO destroyers attempting to resupply the Baltic states were met with a wall of P-800 Onyx supersonic anti-ship missiles. The sea was no longer a highway. It was a graveyard. To understand the grit of this conflict, you have to look at the story of Sergeant Janusz Kowalski. His Leopard tank, Bolek, was the last of its platoon. His loader was unconscious, and his engine was screaming with a blown turbocharger. Through his backup optical sights, a simple glass periscope, he saw a Russian T-14 emerging from the smoke of a burning farmstead. Kowalski didn't have a computer-aided firing solution. He didn't have a laser rangefinder. The air was too thick with multispectral smoke. He used a technique from the 1940s, stadia ranging. He estimated the distance by the size of the enemy tank in his lens. Fire! The 120mm smoothbore cannon roared, the recoil rocking the 70-ton tank back into the mud. The shell, a tungsten core penetrator, struck the T-14's turret ring. The Russian tank didn't explode, it simply stopped. A mobility kill, but Kowalski didn't celebrate. He knew that for every T-14 he stopped, 5 more were grinding through the tree line. By the end of the second day, the Suwalki Gap was a landscape of charred husks. The adrenaline that had sustained the troops for 48 hours was being replaced by a bone-deep, existential exhaustion. This wasn't the heroic war of the movies. This was a war of attended attrition, where the winner wouldn't be the one with the best technology, but the one who could endure the most psychological warfare. In the bunkers, the silence was more terrifying than the noise of the battlefield. The red phone, the direct link between Washington and Moscow, remained silent for 14 hours. Both sides were waiting for the other to blink. The Russian de-escalation through escalation doctrine was being tested to its breaking point. They had taken 30 miles of Polish territory, but at a cost that was unsustainable. The NATO response was preparing for Operation Iron Shield, a massive counteroffensive involving 3 U.S. carrier strike groups and the full weight of the Polish and German air forces. The world was at a symmetric stalemate. If NATO launched the counteroffensive, Russia would likely use tactical nukes to stop it. If NATO didn't, the Baltic states would be lost forever. The midnight flare had provided the spark, but the cyber blackout had provided the darkness in which a world could die. As the third day dawned, the air over Europe was heavy with the heavy silence of a lost battalion. Thousands were dead. The global economy was in a death spiral, and the finger was back on the trigger. This was the real conflict, not just of iron and fire, but of nerves and the impossible odds of survival in a world that had forgotten how to talk. The 72nd hour of the conflict was not marked by a grand crescendo of artillery or a decisive sweeping maneuver across the Suwalki plains. Instead, it was defined by a silence, so profound it felt like the world had simply run out of breath. By the morning of November 15th, the symphony of chaos had transitioned into a stalemate of despair. NATO's Operation Iron Shield was fully coiled, a mechanical viper ready to strike with the collective might of 3 carrier strike groups and the elite paratroopers of the 101st Airborne. On the opposing side, the Russian High Command had reached their sovereign threshold. Their T-14 armatas were battered. Their logistics were a shambles of burning fuel trucks, and their doctrine now dictated a single, terrifying next step: the use of non-strategic nuclear weapons to cleanse the battlefield. We often imagine the end of the world as a loud, dramatic event, but the turning point of the midnight flare occurred in the most claustrophobic, quietest corners of the Earth. The cyber blackout had been too successful. The Russian Krasuka systems and the American Stellar Wind cyber suites had done their jobs so well that they had effectively blinded the gods of war. The red phone, the legendary direct line between the White House and the Kremlin, was a dead piece of plastic. The fiber optic cables were severed, the satellite links were jammed, and the world was operating on analog time in a digital age. This was the turning point, a moment where the very technology meant to give us control had stripped it away. The tragedy was no longer about territory. It was about a lack of an off-ramp. In the underground command center beneath the Kremlin, General Anatoly Mikhailov sat in a room that smelled of ozone and stale cigarettes. He had been given the authorization codes. He was a man of the old guard, a veteran of the Soviet-Afghan War, and he knew that if he turned his key, the midnight flare would be replaced by 1,000 permanent suns. But Mikhailov was haunted by a single piece of intelligence that had arrived not via a high-tech drone, but through a courier on a bicycle who had dodged NATO patrols for 6 hours. The courier brought a handwritten note from a Russian signals officer stationed near the border, Captain Alexei Volkov, the man who had briefly silenced his own jamming equipment in Segment 2. The note contained a single, unverified frequency: an old decommissioned shortwave radio band once used by the Finnish Forest Service during the Cold War. In Washington, General Marcus Thorne was facing a similar crisis of conscience. The civilian leadership was screaming for proportionality. The maps on the wall showed the Baltic states being swallowed. But Thorne, staring at the same false positive data from the initial flare, felt a chilling intuition. He knew that if he launched Iron Shield, he wasn't just starting a counterattack. He was finishing the human story. Thorne did something that contradicted every standing order in the NATO handbook. He ordered his signals team to abandon their encrypted, multi-billion-dollar comms arrays. "Find me something that doesn't use a satellite," he commanded. "Find me a ghost?" The turning point of World War III was a miracle of analog resilience. A young signals sergeant named Miller, working in the bowels of the Pentagon, remembered an old stay-behind network, a series of hidden, low-frequency radio stations buried across Europe during the 1950s as a last-ditch communication web for a post-nuclear world. It was called Project Iron Echo. For 4 agonizing hours, Miller and his team hunted through the static of the ionosphere. The world was at -0. The B-2 Spirit bombers were already over the Atlantic. The Russian subsurface fleet had received their pre-launch authorization. The tension was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that made the very air in the bunkers feel flammable. And then, through a storm of solar radiation and electronic noise, a voice emerged. It wasn't the voice of a president or a premier. It was the crackling, distorted voice of General Mikhailov, speaking in broken English over the Iron Echo frequency. "Washington, this is Moscow. Do you hear the ghost?" The dialogue that followed was not a diplomatic summit. It was a desperate, raw conversation between 2 soldiers who realized they were being pushed into a grave they had dug for themselves. Thorne and Mikhailov bypassed the politicians, the algorithms, and the OODA loops of modern warfare. They spoke man to man, veteran to veteran. "Anatoly," Thorne said, his voice echoing through the low-frequency static. "The flare was a mistake. We know your boys were lost in the storm. We have not launched." "Repeat, we have not launched." There was a silence on the other end that lasted a lifetime. In that silence, the human element finally reasserted itself over the mechanical mandate. Mikhailov looked at the key in his hand. He looked at the junior officers around him, boys whose faces were pale with the realization of what they were about to do. "Marcus," Mikhailov replied, "if you stop the planes, I will stop the fire." But the turning point wasn't just a conversation. It required a physical act of bravery on the ground to prove that the words weren't a ruse. This was the sacrifice of the Hill of Crosses, near the Lithuanian border. A small NATO unit led by a British lieutenant, Sarah Jenkins, was ordered to do the unthinkable. To prove NATO's sincerity, they were told to stand down in the middle of an active firefight. Jenkins and her platoon of 30 men were being hammered by Russian mortar fire. They had the coordinates for a devastating counter-battery strike. Instead, Jenkins ordered her men to cease fire, to step out of their trenches, and to ignite their own white phosphorus flares, not as a weapon, but as a signal. Imagine the courage it took to stand up in a graveyard of rusted iron, surrounded by the enemy, and hold a light into the dark. For 10 minutes, Jenkins and her team stood exposed, the midnight flares in their hands casting long, flickering shadows over the snow. They were waiting to be killed. The Russian tankers, seeing the flares and the motionless NATO soldiers, hesitated. The psychological warfare had shifted. The Russians didn't see a target, they saw a mirror. One by one, the Russian tanks turned their turrets away. The engines were cut. The symphony of chaos was replaced by the heavy silence of a lost battalion that had found its way home. This was the specific act of bravery that changed history. It wasn't a tactical maneuver. It was a tactical refusal. The Helsinki Ghost Channel and the Hill of Crosses provided the off-ramp that the digital world had destroyed. The midnight flare had nearly triggered a nuclear winter, but the flares of peace had held back the frost. As the orders filtered down through the static-choked radios, the midnight war began to evaporate. The B-2 bombers turned back over the Azores. The Russian submarines dived deep and went silent. The cyber blackout remained, but the intent had changed. The world had come within a heartbeat of total annihilation, saved not by the perfection of its machines, but by the intentional, courageous failure of its men to follow them. The legacy of this turning point would be a new understanding of the precipice. We discovered that in the age of AI and hypersonic lethality, our greatest safety feature is the human ability to say no. The midnight flare was a warning, a searing, magnesium white light that showed us the face of the end. And for one night, the human race looked into that light and chose to close its eyes and wait for the natural sun. The turning point was over. The midnight flare had flickered out. But as the troops began the slow, somber process of extraction, the world they were returning to was no longer the one they had left. The impossible odds had been beaten, but the cost was a scar on the global soul that would never truly fade. The silence that followed the 72nd hour was not the silence of peace. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a world that had looked into the sun and realized it was blind. When the guns finally stopped coughing in the Suwalki Gap, the landscape did not return to the idyllic forests of Eastern Europe. It had been transformed into a cartography of grief, a 60-mile stretch of scorched earth, where the scent of pine had been permanently replaced by the stench of ozone, burnt rubber, and the metallic tongue of blood-soaked permafrost. The midnight flare had flickered out, but in its dying light, it had revealed a world so fragile that the mere act of breathing felt like a risk to the collective survival of the species. The immediate aftermath was defined by a period of frantic, subterranean diplomacy that history would come to call the Ashen Peace. Behind the closed doors of a neutral bunker in Geneva, the architects of ruin met to survey the damage they had nearly unleashed. These were not the triumphant summits of 1945. There were no smiles, no staged handshakes for the cameras, and no grand proclamations of peace for our time. Instead, there was a grim, whispered acknowledgement that the systems designed to protect us had almost become our executioners. The silent treaties signed in the wake of the midnight flare were not published in any government gazette. They were a series of desperate, off-record protocols, the human-in-the-loop accords, which mandated that no algorithm, no matter how advanced, could ever again trigger a strategic response without a double-key verification from a physical, breathing human being. The toll of the war was more than just a tally of the 3,000 men and women who vanished into the mud of the Gap. It was the psychological shattering of a generation. For the soldiers who survived, the midnight flare remained a phantom sun that never truly set. Post-traumatic stress. Disorder among the veterans of the Polish 18th Mechanized and the Russian 104th VDV reached unprecedented levels. They spoke of a war of shadows, where the enemy was often invisible, and the greatest threat was a glitch in a sensor. The human element, which had saved the world in the final 60 seconds, was the same element that had been broken by the intensity of the escalation. They were the broken generation, men and women who had seen the end of the world and were now expected to return to a world that did, and even know it had almost died. Economically, the flare triggered a seismic shift in global stability. The Baltic states, once the rising stars of the European tech sector, became a gilded cage. While they remained sovereign, they were transformed into a militarized zone of exclusion. The Suwalki Gap was designated a permanent buffer, a no-man's land littered with the husks of leopard tanks and armatas that were left as macabre monuments to the folly of brinkmanship. Global supply chains, already fragile, buckled under the weight of the new Iron Curtain that descended not from ideology but from sheer terror. The world did not go back to the way it was before November 12th. It simply learned to live in a state of permanent low-grade fever. But the most haunting legacy of the midnight flare is found in the silent files of the Pentagon. And the Kremlin, the data logs of those 3 minutes when the world sat on the precipice. Analysis later revealed that if General Thorne had followed protocol, the first wave of Minuteman III missiles would have exited their silos just as the flare began to fade. We survived by a margin of seconds, a margin so thin it shouldn't have existed. It was a failure of the machine that allowed for the triumph of the soul. The technical retreat that followed was unprecedented. The hyper-war doctrines that prioritized speed and AI-driven decision-making were quietly dismantled. The military-industrial complexes of the world's superpowers began a process of strategic deceleration, realizing that in the age of nuclear weapons, speed was not an asset, it was a death sentence. The Suwalki Gap itself became a place of pilgrimage and a graveyard of rusted iron. Thousands of tons of destroyed military hardware were left where they fell, too contaminated or too symbolic to be moved. The landscape of charred husks became an open-air museum of 21st century failure. Moss began to grow over the scorched turrets of T-14s, and the trenches where Polish scouts had shivered were slowly reclaimed by the forest. But the earth there is different. High concentrations of magnesium and phosphorus from the flares and the white phosphorus rounds used during the skirmish have altered the soil chemistry. The trees that grow in the gap today are stunted, their leaves a pale, sickly silver, a biological echo of the light that almost ended the world. The geopolitical significance today is rooted in the Suwalki Protocol. Every year on November 12th, the heads of state of the NATO alliance and the Russian Federation observe 60 seconds of total radio silence. It is the only time the red phone is tested with a message that has nothing to do with war. The message is always the same: we are still here. This ritual is a reminder that the peace we enjoy is not a natural state. It is a conscious, exhausting choice made every day by fallible human beings. The midnight flare proved that the greatest threat to human survival is either the enemy across the border or the rival ideology. The greatest threat is our own ingenuity outstripping our wisdom. We built a world where a lost patrol and a magnesium shell could trigger a nuclear winter, and we only survived because one man had the courage to doubt his own machines. Today, as we look back at the grainy footage of burning convoys and hear the intercepted recordings of panicked young men, the question isn't how it started. The question is how many more midnight flares we can survive before the human element is finally and permanently removed from the equation. The legacy of the flare is a chilling memento mori. It is a reminder that we live on a precipice, and that the sun rising every morning is not a guarantee, is a reprieve. The midnight sun that rose over Poland that night didn't bring light. It showed us the depth of the darkness we are capable of creating. It showed us that we are not the masters of our technology, but its hostages. And as the silver-leaved trees of the Suwalki Gap continue to grow over the rusted iron of the Midnight War, they stand as a silent, living warning. The next time the sky shatters at midnight, there may be no one left to hold the light. The world today exists in the long shadow of those 72 hours. The ashen peace has held for decades, but it is a peace built on the memory of terror rather than the foundation of trust. We have learned to live with the ghost of the midnight flare, forever aware that the distance between a warning and the end is only 60 seconds of human intuition. We are the survivors of a war that never fully happened, residents of a future that was almost stolen by a single spark in the dark. The midnight flare was never just a military engagement. It was a mirror. As we move further away from that cold November night in 2025, the dust has settled on the Suwalki Gap, but the intellectual and existential fallout continues to radiate through our global consciousness. This final analysis, The Lessons of the Gap, delves into how this 72-hour anomaly fundamentally rewired the human species' relationship with power, technology, and the very concept of the enemy. To understand the world we inhabit today, one must visit the Suwalki exclusion zone. It is a place where time has been arrested. Thousands of acres of Polish and Lithuanian borderland remain a graveyard of rusted iron. Because of the density of unexploded ordnance and the silent treaties that prohibit new construction in the buffer zone, the landscape is a pristine, terrifying monument to the precipice. Here, the human element is palpable. You can walk past the charred chassis of a Bradley fighting vehicle and, 10 meters away, find the twisted remains of a Russian Tiger M. They are often locked together, a grim embrace of steel that tells the story of the symphony of chaos better than any history book ever could. The first and most enduring lesson of the midnight flare is the fallacy of the perfect machine. For 20 years leading up to the skirmish, military theorists argued that the fog of war would be lifted by big data, AI, and ubiquitous sensors. They promised a glass battlefield where every movement was tracked and every intent was known. The midnight flare shattered that myth. It proved that the more complex a system becomes, the more catastrophic its failure modes. When the cyber blackout hit, the most advanced military force in human history was reduced to the tactical equivalent of the Napoleonic Wars, but with the lethality of the atomic age. We learned that technology doesn't eliminate the fog of war. It merely digitizes it, making it faster and more impenetrable. The second lesson is the burden of the individual. History is often taught as the movement of great masses, of nations and ideologies clashing like tectonic plates. But the midnight flare teaches us that the survival of 7 billion people once hung on the heartbeat of a single man in a bunker and the steady hand of a lieutenant on a hill. General Marcus Thorne and Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins did not follow their training. They transcended it. They exhibited tactical disobedience, the rare and terrifying courage to recognize that the system was wrong and the machine was lying. The lessons of the Gap have led to a radical shift in military education worldwide. Today, officers are not just taught how to operate their weapons, they are taught how to question them. The Thorne Doctrine now mandates that human intuition must always be the final circuit breaker in any lethal chain. The third lesson is the fragility of the off-ramp in the 20th century. The red phone was a physical symbol of the desire to avoid the end. In the 21st century, we allowed that link to become buried under layers of encryption and automated firewalls. When the midnight flare ignited, we realized we had built a world where we could kill each other in milliseconds, but couldn't talk to each other for hours. The Helsinki Ghost Channel, that ancient, crackling shortwave frequency, became the most valuable piece of real estate in the world. It taught us that as we move toward the future, we must maintain our analog anchors. The silent treaties now require every nuclear-armed nation to maintain a series of low-tech, unjammable communication methods that bypass the digital grid entirely. We have learned that to save the future, we must keep one foot in the past. Geopolitically, the midnight flare led to the Great Deceleration. Before 2025, the world was obsessed with hyperwar missiles that traveled at Mach 10 and algorithms that made decisions in microseconds. The flare showed us that speed is a liability in a nuclear world. If you have no time to think, you have no time to be human. The strategic deceleration movement has since slowed the deployment of autonomous weapon systems. We have collectively realized that winning a war that lasts only 6 minutes is a mathematical impossibility. In that time frame, there are only degrees of losing. The psychological legacy of the Ashen Peace remains the most complex element of this history. We live in a world that is post-certainty. We no longer believe that it can't happen here. The midnight flare took the abstract fear of the Cold War and made it a tangible, visceral memory. Every time a power grid flickers or a satellite link drops, the global collective heart skips a beat. We are a species living with a form of planetary PTSD, yet within that fear lies a strange kind of hope. The flare forced a level of transparency between rivals that was previously unthinkable. The Suwalki Protocol observations are not just rituals. They are a form of shared trauma that has created a more resilient, if more cynical, peace. As we conclude this analysis, we must look at the midnight flare not as a tragedy that was avoided, but as a warning that was heard. The landscape of charred husks in Poland is not just a graveyard, it is a schoolroom. It teaches us that the heavy silence of a lost battalion is a sound we must never permit again. It reminds us that the magnesium light of the flare was not the sun, but a false dawn that offered only fire. The real midnight flare was the realization that we are all, regardless of flag or uniform, trapped in the same trench at -30 degrees. We are all tripwires. We are all hostages to the machines we have built. And we are all, ultimately, dependent on the courage of a stranger to hold the light and wait for the natural morning. The story of World War III is the story of the war that stayed in the dark. It is the history of the impossible odds that were defeated by the most basic of human traits: doubt, mercy, and the refusal to blink. As the silver-leaved trees of the Suwalki exclusion zone continue to grow, they stand as a testament to the night the world almost ended and the morning the human race decided, against all logic and every machine, to keep going. The midnight flare has flickered out, the sky is dark again. But in that darkness, we have learned to see each other more clearly than we ever did in the light. This is the legacy of the Gap, This is the toll of the war that almost was. And this is the hope for the history that is yet to be written. The line between a glorious victory and a forgotten catastrophe is thinner than a razor's edge. At War Atelier, we don't just tell you what happened, we show you how it felt to stand on that edge. Hit the bell icon to ensure you never miss a deep dive into the shadows of military history. The archives are open.